Appreciate that introduction. And if we could advance to the first slide. So I'm a tribal citizen of the Dene, the Navajo Nation, and so it's my honor to be here today and to contribute to this important discussion. I'm sharing a map of the state of California. It's a California tribal lands map of tribal territories prior to contact. The first people of California occupied this land tens of thousands of years before European contact, and their lands were taken away first by the Spanish government, next by the Mexican government, next by the United States after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and finally by California after it became a state in 1850. In the 1850s, the United States negotiated 18 treaties with a handful of tribes who survived the prior 200 years of contact. And those 18 treaties have reserved 9% of the state for these tribal nations. The United States has over 574 tribes. California has 109 of those tribes and over 70 non-federally recognized tribes. The state of California also has the largest concentration of tribes in the United States, as well as population of tribal citizens. Many of our tribal citizens that make up the over 800,000 tribal governments and tribal citizens are also from out of state, such as myself, who's Navajo, and many of those tribal nations were relocated to California and to some of the major cities due to relocation policies. Mainly, those relocation cities were Sacramento, not Sacramento, but San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the San Diego area. And so that created several generations of many urban Indians who still reside here today. And they are the current California citizens in addition to the indigenous population. Next slide, please. The American River watershed is the ancestral homeland to California Native American tribes. And the term California Native American tribes is inclusive of federally recognized and non-federally recognized tribes from throughout California. You may have heard terms such as First Nations. This is a term used to describe the first people of Canada. Another term is Indigenous, and that's a term used to cover the original inhabitants of the land. The state of California uses the term California Native American Tribe, and the federal government uses the term American Indian. The first people of this land, they prefer to use our traditional names. For myself, the Navajo Nation, we prefer to be called Dene, which means the people. And the people of your watershed prefer to use their traditional names, their original names, such as the Nishinan, the Maidu, the Miwoks, the Yokuts, and the Patwin people. They are the original inhabitants who encompass the watershed, and they also continue to utilize the land today. The ancestral footprint of the American River watershed can be further traced up to the mouth of the watershed, which will take you into the northern Sierra area, bringing us into the traditional homelands of the Mountain Maidu, the Sierra Miwoks, the Washoe people. Next slide, please. So I'm honored to speak here, and as a traditional person, I've asked permission to speak on the land of the traditional people, so I thank them for that permission to do so. So when you understand protocols of what is tribal engagement, you are probably hearing things in terms of land acknowledgement, understanding ancestral land. So these protocols of tribal engagement from a state policy perspective would take a lot more time than I'm allotted today. And so I'm just going to be very brief on, and I apologize for the limitations, but it's a good opportunity to share some of these understandings. I'm going to cover very briefly topics of ancestral land, state policies and consultation, respect for tribal sovereignty, and speak briefly on tribal cultural resources. So tribal engagement is, if we could stay on that first slide. Tribal engagement is already a challenging concept, and it's based on subjective factors, such as determining, what type of meeting. Is it informational? Is it formal? Is it a government-to-government consultation? Who's going to be present at the meeting? Are you starting with decision makers? Do you have a communication on a staff-to-staff level? Will the meeting start with a prayer, a recognition? And if you're a state agency, Who determines the meeting? And now during the period of COVID, what are the various platforms to use that would ensure confidentiality and authenticity for tribes to be able to speak to one another with this virtual engagement? What is not to be lost is that tribal governments are sovereign entities, and they have a separate status beyond a stakeholder status. And how are we achieving the required mandate for public engagement through a public stakeholder process when tribal governments as sovereign entities have a unique status above the public? Next slide, please. So the Water Forum has a duty of stewardship and developing co-management practices with the beneficial users of the basin. And as stewards of the basin, your co-management practices must take into consideration the effects of the gold rush era mismanagement, the state policies of displacement of the basin's original inhabitants, the tribes that have the cultural affiliations to the watershed. The tribes who are the first inhabitant of this land practice land management. We refer to that practice as traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, or tribal knowledge, sometimes referred to simply as TEK. The American River watershed has fragile resources, and these resources are at risk due to drought, flooding, and wild land fire. There is a duty to protect cultural resources that allow for tribes to exercise their traditional uses of the land. This watershed contains many sensitive areas that are sacred and used for ceremony and other contemporary uses that are still practiced today. Some of the various traditional uses have been reliant upon wild and native plants, and these plant materials are used for basket weaving, ceremonial, everyday adornment, and medicinal needs. Let's talk a little bit about beneficial use and historical use. In the context of a state or local agency jargon, historical use is usually measured from the time of contact, typically the gold rush era. In terms of beneficial use, we also err on a narrow definition of recreational use or municipal use. The various dams along the American River used for hydroelectric power has had very much negative impacts to traditional use, as well as what we've heard earlier about effects upon the fish and plant species. Co-management is to seek out partnerships with the tribes who are culturally affiliated within your jurisdictional area. A first step is to know and understand who are the tribes culturally affiliated within your area of jurisdiction. Which tribal partners claim an ancestral tie, since it is the tribes themselves who define what is their cultural resource. By doing so and developing these partnerships and relationships, you are respecting tribal sovereignty. These partnerships will be needed as you develop co-management practice, you develop communication protocols during the times of emergency events and disaster management. Your communication protocols will cover points of contacts with tribal representatives. It will also cover the need for confidentiality and sharing information on sensitive areas. If you intend to embark on any major dam decommissioning in the future or any other type of major water project, you will be required to consult with tribes on a formal basis, either through local, state, or federal consultation, depending on the project and the necessary permits required. There are many requirements for consultation, but a first step is contacting the Native American Heritage Commission to obtain a list of the tribes who are in your area of jurisdiction. Utilize the Native American Heritage Commission as a first start to inventory your land and to seek out the sacred lands inventory. This is a confidential communication, and you need to seek out that information as well as from the California Historical Resource Information System, also known as the CRIS system. Both inventories cover sites, landscapes, petroglyphs, pictographs, other ceremonial places, burial places, and historic structures. So who has access to this information within your governance structure is important to note, and also for your tribal partners to know that you have a communication protocol and practice of maintaining confidentiality of that information. Next slide, please. This is but a very small representation of state policies to become familiar with. And keep in mind that tribes themselves have developed their own consultation policies, which you should also seek out within your communication with the tribes and to become very much familiar with. Just recently, on September 25th, on California Native American Day, Governor Newsom, excuse me, is my video still going? My computer said my video was off, so I'm
Yes,
hoping it's still going.
it's going.
Thank you. Thank you. So just recently on September 25th, Governor Newsom unveiled a new policy, a statement of an administration policy on native ancestral lands. I mentioned earlier the 18 treaties that were negotiated with the tribes in California. These treaties were opposed by California senators, and they were never ratified by the Senate. They were hidden from the public view by the Senate for over 50 years. Many of the tribes who negotiated these treaties were never told that the treaties they signed were never ratified. And part of the reason for not ratifying these treaties was due to the discovery of gold along the American River watershed in Coloma, and due to greed, avarice, and other backroom dealings. The state of California didn't ratify the treaties since the discovery of gold made the land far too valuable to turn over to the Indians. In recognition of these past injustices, this new policy by our governor directs every state agency to give Native Americans the opportunities to access, to co-manage, and to acquire lands under the ownership and control of the state of California. The state and our local partners who manage state-owned lands will be learning how to understand, interpret, and implement this very, very new policy. The purpose of the policy is to partner and facilitate tribal access, use, and co-management of state-owned or controlled land, and to also facilitate access to sacred sites and cultural resources, and improve the ability of tribes to engage in their traditional and sustenance gathering, hunting and fishing, and partner with California tribes on land management and stewardship using traditional ecological knowledge. I'm going to leave you with this last slide. And this last slide, if you could advance, please, is the definition under AB 52, which is the 2014 amendment to the CEQA Act, which defined and put into our new language under CEQA TCRs, which is Traditional Cultural Resources, and made a definition under the Public Resources Code of what is a traditional cultural resource, and also the involvement in the instructions there to, when you're working with tribes with the CEQA project, of contacting the Native American Heritage Contact List. And so that's, I've also followed this presentation with some resources, the state policy. If you could return back to the slide of it and ahead of this, the state policies. I provided some resources on Executive Order B1011 and Executive Order N1519, and that follows the slide so that you can get a better understanding of what those policies are. But I thank you for this time, and I'm looking forward to taking some questions and speaking to you on the panel.
Thank you so much, Anecita. So again, want to highlight those resources at the end of your presentation. Thank you for compiling those, and want to let folks know that we'll send out an email afterwards with a link to the Water Forum website for the presentation.